high atop the forest-covered hills of Washington state, and a group of experienced hikers had made camp for their journey. They were ready for a night of rest and relaxation. Little did they know that lurking in the shadows was a mysterious figure that would soon put their courage to the test. Legend has it that those who have ventured deep around the ape caves have encountered something terrifying. As darkness descended, they were soon thrust into a terrifying experience they would never forget. Was it really Bigfoot stalking them in the night, or just their imaginations running wild? Jacob and Stan had been planning their camping trip to Washington state for a while now. They were experienced, they were eager to take on the challenge of trekking through and near the ape caves. As they ventured deeper in the woods, they soon settled on an area near an old abandoned cabin as their site for camp. But little did they know that their peaceful night's rest would be disturbed by something far more sinister than any of them could have imagined. It was just after dusk when Stan noticed a set of strange tracks leading away from the campsite. Believing it to be too large for any normal animal, his friends exchanged worried glances before turning back to search for signs of danger in the shadows. It was then that a low growl emitted and echoed through the night air, sending shivers up all of their spines. And suddenly, from behind a thicket, two yellow eyes appeared and began moving towards them with swiftness and agility. The creature continued prowling around the campsite for what seemed like hours, before finally disappearing into the night without a trace. The group awoke to a strange sight the next morning. All around their campsite, huge tracks could be seen in the ground, as if an enormous creature had been pacing back and forth during night. Even more alarming were the broken tree branches they found, at least 8 to 9 feet high on one of the nearby trees. It was clear that something not so ordinary had been lurking around their camp, and it was downright eerie to witness the power of this mysterious being. After quickly packing up and leaving, the men agreed that this was an experience they would never forget, and one that left them with more questions than answers about the existence of Bigfoot. Now, before their camping trip, these men had all heard stories of Ape Canyon and the legends surrounding it, but none of them had truly believed in the possibility of encountering such a thing until this fateful night. Even now, as they reflected on their experience, it almost seemed like a dream, too surreal to be real. Nonetheless, when they recalled the yellow eyes that stared back at them through the darkness, or remembering the deep growl that reverberated around them, they knew without a shadow of a doubt that they had come face to face with the mythical beast known as Bigfoot. Still, feelings of awe, fear, and mystery remained with each of them as they tried to wrap their minds around what had happened that night. Now, if you even have a passing familiarity with the Bigfoot phenomenon, you likely know some of the landmark cases, the Patterson-Gimlin footage, the Ruby Creek incident, the Minnesota Iceman, etc. Cryptozoologists are quick to mention these events whenever making their case that large hairy hominids live alongside human beings in North America. Now, one of the more popular tales is the harrowing saga of Ape Canyon. It has been told time and time again in cryptozoological books and documentaries. In fact, you've probably heard this story, but you probably haven't heard the full story, which has largely been sanitized by cryptozoologists who wish to omit the strangest of details. According to the frightening tale, which burst onto the scene in July 16, 1924, the issue of the Oregonian newspaper, a group of 5 gold miners in Skamania County, Washington, endured a violent encounter with a troop of ape men. The attack seemed to have been instigated by a member of the crew named Hank. Damn it, Hank. Several days before, the men had encountered a host of oddities around their mining claim, including the creatures, which were described as 7 feet tall, each weighing in an excess of 400 pounds. They left behind footprints that measured 13 to 14 inches long. And the day of the attack, Hank had taken 3 pot shots at one of the creatures, but had missed. Thanks again, Hank, you're doing great. It seems as if the Bigfoot did not appreciate this loving, warming gesture. When the men reconvened at their cabin on the southeast shoulder of Mount St. Helens, they all agreed that it seemed wise to return home, but had no desire to make the trek back to their vehicle in the darkness. I mean, I can't blame them. They decided to wait until the safety of daybreak. Now, all remained calm until around midnight, when a shocking blow landed against the wall of the cabin. Bam! Whatever had hit the building was so forceful that it dislodged some of the ceiling between the logs, known as chinking, raining it down on the men's chest. Hank was hit with an especially large chunk, disorienting him for a few moments before the others helped him to his feet. Now, outside the cabin, a rain of thunderous footfalls echoed in the chilly Washington evening. The men grabbed their rifles, fearing the worst. Although the building had no windows, the blow that had struck the cabin had now created plenty of small gaps where the chinking had fallen loose, allowing the miners to peer between the logs. And through one of these holes, Hank and the others were able to see 3 Bigfoot-like creatures huddled together, ready to assault the cabin. It sounded as if many more lurked in the background. The miners all agreed that to avoid escalation, they should only open fire if the cabin seemed to be under direct attack. 2 of the men cowered in the corner. The other 3 stood at the ready, awaiting whatever came next. If a truce existed between the Bigfoot and the men, it was short-lived. It wasn't long until something large could be heard on the roof, not simply walking, but moving with a forceful intent. It seemed as if it wished to bring the cabin down on top of the men. In response, they fired their weapons through the ceiling. Then came an assault upon the front door, far worse than the IRS demanding their payment. The creature were trying to bash it down, forcing the defenders to brace it with a large pole or board taken from one of the bunk beds. Even this did not seem to deter the assault, forcing the men to turn the cabin's door into Swiss cheese with their own rifles. The siege dragged on for hours, and throughout the ordeal, heavy stones and boulders, flung with great force, smashed against the outside walls, causing them to tremble. The miners were only allowed a few moments of rest between each attack. One of these quiet interludes was interrupted when the men noticed a large, hairy hand reaching through the newly created space between the logs. The hideous appendage was reaching for the handle of the axe. After it grasped onto the weapon, one of the men, thinking quickly and unable to pry it from the vice-like grip, turned the axe vertically, creating a puzzle that the Bigfoot was incapable of solving. As it tried to pull the axe out of the cabin, Hank fired at the hand. Bam! Now, although it missed the creature, probably Hank, the creature dropped the weapon and retreated back outside. Finally, activity seemed to calm down just before daybreak. With an abundance of caution, the 5 miners carefully stepped out of the cabin and surveyed the damage. It wasn't long before they set off in the direction of their vehicle. Minutes into the trip, one of the creatures was spotted some 80 yards away, standing by the edge of the canyon. This time, the miners' aim was true, because it probably wasn't Hank, and the Bigfoot was apparently struck. It teetered for a moment before careening over the cliff and into the gorge, landing some 400 feet below their feet. Now this, in the broadest of strokes, is the Ape Canyon story, as you will hear it from mainstream cryptozoologists. Yet, over the years, whether deliberately or by accident, critical details have been omitted. They aren't hard to find, nor are they actively suppressed. They are just conveniently omitted whenever most people retell the tale. One of the men involved in the Ape Canyon attack authored a short pamphlet outlining not only the entire night, but the events leading up to it. His name was Fred Beck. It is in the words of Fred where we find some of the oddest details so often left out of the Ape Canyon narrative. Details which seem to indicate that something far stranger, maybe even paranormal, happened that night. While most cryptozoologists treat the Ape Canyon story as proof of gigantic flesh and blood animals, Fred felt that their cabin had been attacked by, for lack of a better term, spirits. The suppression of Fred's testimony is frustrating. Accounts from eyewitnesses are the bedrock of any investigation into the unknown. I mean, if you wish to treat these topics seriously, eyewitness testimony should be heard, especially if it comes from a primary witness like Fred Beck. Now, whether they saw a large animal or whether they saw something stranger, they deserve evaluation. This isn't to say that we have to believe everybody's opinion of what they saw, but rather that their testimony deserves to be shared just as much as the words of someone who saw something more conventional. This is the real story of what happened in Ape Canyon in 1924. Now, Fred Beck finally committed his memories to paper on September 27, 1967, with the help of his son, Ronald A. Beck. Fred outlined his thoughts and recollections as best he could in a booklet entitled, "I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, Washington." The result is short, just shy of 10,000 words, but is truly invaluable. No one argues whether or not Fred was there that summer night in 1924, regardless of what happened. And to have so much first-hand testimony so well thought out is truly a treasure. Fred opens his book by saying this: "It is my intention in this book to not only tell you about the historic encounter I had with these mysterious creatures, but also to reveal to the public what I believe they are. Truth often is stranger than fiction, but the strangeness comes from the clouds surrounding our minds, not from the mystery itself." Now, this is not a large book, but may the largeness be conveyed by the picture I hope to paint of truth. Much has been written about the day in 1924, and I feel it right that I express my views at last. Fred makes no bones about those views, which always tended towards the mystical even at an early age. He had always considered himself mildly clairvoyant, although a more accurate description might be that he had always been helped by his spirit guides. One of the examples that he provides happened as a child. He had saved up enough money to buy a bean shooter, but had lost it after playing in a field. Remember, it was a simpler time. Fortnite did not exist yet for you youngins. So, the loss of his favorite toy, so expensive to a child that it might as well have been irreplaceable, had left young Fred inconsolable. As he lay in the meadow crying, Fred said that a loving presence came to him in the form of a kindly woman. Now, this figure wrapped her arms around Fred in a warm embrace and reassured him, saying, "Little boy, don't cry. Go home. You will find your bean shooter there." And according to Fred, that is exactly what had happened. The easiest explanation is that he had simply misplaced it in a fit of childhood distraction. But according to Fred, this was a brand new identical bean shooter. He discovered his original toy years later, bent and broken, the rubber bands long since rotten. Fred's relationship with this strange woman would continue throughout his childhood. During long church sermons, he would often lay down on the hard wooden pews of his parents' Adventist church. Often the woman's lap would be there to cradle his head. Whenever he mentioned this to his parents, they said it was his imagination. There was never anybody else there. And once he grew into an adult, Fred became a spiritualist, and he claimed to have had many visions throughout his lifetime. This, of course, opens Fred's word up to criticism, especially from anyone who feels that Bigfoot is strictly a flesh and blood animal. However, there are many tribes and many natives that would disagree. But I digress. Anyone claiming that they experienced supernatural visitors in childhood is obviously a kook, right? I mean, come on, the supernatural doesn't exist, or so they claim, and the rest of their testimony should be thrown out. Now, this is unfair. While Fred's metaphysical leanings heavily color his interpretation of the 1924 events, it does not mean that we have to abandon the whole of his account, including the strange events, which, according to him, were witnessed by other miners. Today, cryptozoologists typically cherry-pick Fred Beck's story, using only the parts that confirm their own biases. Yet, much of what we know about the Ape Canyon events come from Fred's pen. To that end, he also provided an excellent overview of the pivotal days beforehand. And even from the start, strange things seemed afoot, things filled with what Fred called the psychic element. Fred even claimed that the method by which they discovered the Ape Canyon mining claim had been psychically influenced. Fred wrote this: "In 1922, we found the location of our mind. A spiritual being, a large native dressed in buckskin, appeared to us and talked to us. He was the picture of stateliness himself. He never told us his name, but we always called him the Great Spirit. He replied once, 'The Great Spirit is above me. We are all the Great Spirit if we listen when the Great Spirit talks.' There was another spiritual being which appeared to us, more in the role of a comforting friend, and we learned her name. One of our party suggested later that we name our mine after her, and so the mining claim we later filed bore her last name, Vanderwhite. The big native being told us there would be a white arrow going before us. Another man who was not present during the attack in 1924 could see the arrow easily and clearly at all times, and I could see it nearly as well. So we started by the Lewis River, south of Mount St. Helens, and went up the Muddy River. In all, we followed the white arrow 4 days. The going was slow, for in those days it was very rugged territory. Hank's temper and lack of proper aim was growing short as he climbed the hills. He had always been a believer of spiritual things, and afterwards he was certainly a believer. But he lost his temper and cussed. He swore at the spirit leading us. His face was red, and we could not stop him. 'Just a wild goose chase,' he exclaimed. 'They lied to us and got us running all over the hills, and I want nothing more to do with them.' He went on and on. Then, just when he had started to calm down, we all saw the arrow soar up high, change direction, and then swoop down. We had to follow in the general direction before we could find it again. It hovered near the top of the north cliff of Ape Canyon. That was the site where we later blasted out our shaft. We got a little closer, and we all saw the image of a large door open, and the big native appeared in front of it. He spoke. 'Because you have cursed the spirit leading you, you will be shown where there is gold, but it is not given to you.' With those words, he disappeared. Then we saw the door slowly close. There was a huge lock and latch, but as the door shut, the lock did not latch. A closed door, but it was not locked. 'We just as well pack up and go home,' one of the party said. And that is just the way our gold mine turned out. Closed, but not locked. We worked that mine for 2 years, and one assay showed well over $2,000 a ton. But as it turned out, what we had actually done was to cut the leaders. There is a pocket of gold in that cliff if somebody is fortunate enough to find it. We gave up looking for it. There's a lot to unpack in Fred's words. Native American spirit guides, the apparition of a lady, a white arrow in the sky. What is this doing in a story about Bigfoot? Now, in some ways, the first anomaly is the easiest to understand. While plenty of indigenous tribes hold that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood animal, there are many others that believe it is a spirit, or at the very least, that it is a physical with inexplicable spiritual powers. In fact, the appearance of a Native American spirit guide suggests the existence of a spirit world as described by the country's original inhabitants, or at least something beyond the physical realm we all know and live in. Whether this spirit realm objectively resembles indigenous cosmology or not, it implies that something else lies beyond the fringes of human perception. At the very least, it provides further insight into Fred Beck's worldview. The strange vision of the lady is a little more interesting, at least compared to other Bigfoot stories. In the 2020 Bigfoot book series Where the Footprint Ends, researcher and podcaster Timothy Renner uncovered a bizarre trend that, time and time again throughout world mythologies, wild men are often paired with women in white. The association is perhaps ancient. For example, in parts of England, folklore holds that the oldest tree is an apple orchard, is said to embody the spirit of a wild man known as the ape tree man. This wild man is assisted by another spirit, that of an elderly woman, draped in white. Even as far back as the 1400s, an old English saying held that any woman who died a virgin would not only be damned, but suffer an especially cruel fate. Such as die maids do all lead apes in hell, it went. Now, this statement is more complex than it seems. I mean, there's some anti-Catholic sentiment in there, among other things, but the idea is that undesirable creatures would have their way with maidens after they died. The color most closely associated with the purity of maidens was, of course, the color white. Now, these associations endure to this day. Consider the classic image of King Kong, the enormous ape clutching the damsel in distress who almost always wears the color white. Some Bigfoot encounters feature strange women in white, either at the symbolic level or literally. One of the most popular stories on the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast features a pair of brothers who were dealing with Bigfoot encounters and other mysterious phenomena around their land. Among the other presences that they had run into was an elderly woman who sometimes crossed their property. Now, she seemed to be in her 60s, but was abnormally tall and always wore ragged, dirty white clothing. Her oversized shoes were white as well. Now, this woman would appear when the Bigfoot were vocalizing and seemed able to vanish at will. After consulting a psychic medium, the brothers learned that she was not a human being, but rather something which took the appearance of a human, perhaps a demon. The medium told the two brothers that she possessed control over the Bigfoot creatures like a puppeteer, which emerged from the earth at her command. It's a wild story, yes, but completely consistent from a folkloric perspective. So, returning to the Ape Canyon story, we have a spectral woman appearing to Fred Beck and the other miners, leading them to a part of Washington state where they would run afoul of wild men. While Fred Beck never described the woman in any detail, remember that he said they named their mining claim after her. The name was Vander White. It seems at least possible that she was dressed in white. If not, there is at least white in her name. Finally, there is the arrow in the sky, which should make anyone interested in UFOs take notice. There isn't much to add to this detail, beyond remarking on how similar signs and portents stretch back millennia, and were often regarded as divine blessings or omens. If only the arrow were better described, we could learn a little bit more. Did it resemble a structured craft, a light, or simply a wisp of cloud? Now, it is interesting to note that not everyone could see the arrow consistently. This aspect, while rarely discussed, appears in quite a few modern UFO reports, where only certain members of a group will see something in the sky. Even when everyone does agree that they saw a UFO, descriptions can vary wildly from one person to another person, with some describing different shapes, different color lights, and other particulars. Now, for 6 years, Fred and the gold miners worked their claim, always in good spirits, but never able to shake the sense that they would leave empty-handed. They noticed oddities right away. Among these were immense footprints, On at least one occasion, these tracks were left in a place that defied all rational explanation. Before the men erected their cabin, they stayed in a small tent alongside one of the canyon's many creeks. In the center of the creek was a sandbar, perhaps an acre or so in size. Now, each morning, the men would visit the creek to wash their utensils and fetch water. But one morning, they found something inexplicable, and Fred wrote this. Early one morning, Hank came back to the tent. He was rather excited. He led us to the moist sandbar and took us almost to the center. There we were, standing in the middle of the sandbar, and not one of us could conceive any earthly thing taking steps 160 feet long. No human being could have made these tracks, Hank said, and there's only one way that they could have been made. Something dropped from the sky and went back up. Now, the appearance of footprints in places where they couldn't or shouldn't be is something that Bigfoot hunters run into regularly in the field. Bigfoot trackways sometimes end in vast open meadows, or footprints might appear all by themselves outside of any other trackway. Sometimes these discrepancies can be easily explained away. Perhaps the creatures stepped to another bit of ground that did not transfer their footprints, or maybe they leapt into a nearby tree. Now, these explanations are reasonable enough, but other scenarios like the one Fred Beck and his miners discovered defy all rational explanation. Now, some cryptozoologists say that Bigfoot are capable of superhuman leaps. It is true that many sightings feature Bigfoot bounding away with an athletic grace typically reserved for animals like kangaroos. But when footprints end in a vast open field with hundreds of feet of untouched ground all around them, these explanations fail. The two animals that hold the record for jumping distances are the snow leopard and the klipspringer, a type of African antelope. Both seem capable of jumping 50 feet horizontally. Now, for Bigfoot to leap 100 feet, they would have to be the greatest jumpers in the animal kingdom. So, what do? Where the footprints end? Some think that Bigfoot tiptoe backwards and retrace their tracks. Others think that Bigfoot grab a branch and smooth out their footprints, removing all traces of their escape routes. Neither explanation seems especially convincing. I mean, surely backtracking would leave more evidence. Bigfoot researchers who are trained to scrutinize the tiniest details of footprints rarely notice evidence of a second footfall in these tracks. And even the most careful attempt to brush away an exit route through mud or snow especially would leave obvious indications that the trackway had been tampered with. Then, to make things even stranger, we have solitary footprints, like the ones that the Ape Canyon miners encountered with no approach whatsoever. It is like Hank said, something dropped from the sky and went back up. The gold miners also became used to unnerving noises around their claim, which flooded the canyon both day and night. Some of the sounds resembled screams, while others sounded like a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on the chest. Where the noise was coming from always proved difficult to pinpoint. In fact, Fred wrote this: "The same thudding, hollow thumping noise we heard at night preceded the attack. We also had heard in broad daylight, although not nearly so loud. One of our party was a little irritated with me. On our excursions, he usually led the way and I followed a little behind the others. We kept hearing that sound and occasionally he turned around and would say, 'What's that?' After 6 or 8 times of him doing this, and after a few general discussions about the noise, he quickly turned around one more time and eyed me and said, 'By golly, boys, it's not Fred making that noise after all.' But he decided to give it a double check. He made an excuse and wandered away from the camp. Where he came back, he said, 'Now I'm certain it's none of us. I walked for half an hour and everywhere I went, I heard it. It sounds like there's a hollow drum in the earth somewhere and something or someone is hitting it.' Now, this noise is familiar to students of the paranormal. It appears at numerous places with high Bigfoot activity. Perhaps most famously for those of you in Washington state is the Yakima Indian Reservation. Subterranean sounds are also a staple of UFO lore, where they represent underground alien bases or fairy folklore, where they might represent entities like dwarves living or working deep underground. Now, during this time mining around Mount St. Helens, Fred Beck claimed another bizarre encounter. He was walking the trail from Spirit Lake one afternoon when he began to feel incredibly lonely. As he rounded a curve, a beautiful young lady stood in his path. The two began talking with the immediate familiarity that old friends might share, and he learned that she and her father visited every summer and that he was away hunting in the forest. She was one of the most pleasant persons I had ever spoken to in my life, Fred said. When we parted, she told me where she and her father were camped and asked me to visit them that evening. When he visited that night, Fred was surprised how far away their camp was from where they had met. The girl, who seemed no more than 18, must be quite hardy to have hiked so far alone. Nonetheless, Fred arrived at camp where he found the girl, but no sign of her father. In fact, there was no sign of anything. Fred noticed that there were no cooking utensils, no food, and no tent. What's more, she would regularly address her father, even though there was nobody else around. The conversation they held that night matched the summer evening. Pleasant, but more than a bit odd. After enjoying their chat, Fred left in a sort of daze. Only in hindsight did he realize how peculiar everything had been. There was another event prior to the Ape Canyon siege that places Fred Beck's encounter firmly in the realm of the paranormal. He seems to have experienced what parapsychologists would call an apport. Apports are common in hauntings and especially in poltergeist cases, where they often manifest stones, bits of glass, and other odds and ends. Now, in Fred's case, his apport seemed to be brought about by his need for something with which to write. He explained the event. One day, we needed a pencil to make a description of our claim. We found we had not brought one along with us. Everybody was a little put out. But then it came, a pencil was in my hand. It had tooth marks all over it. When that trip was over and I was home, I showed the pencil to my wife and she said, "Why, that's a pencil I bought when you were gone. How did you get it?" She said my oldest son, then a young tot, was chewing on it and she took it away from him and had put it in a drawer. She went and looked for it and found no pencil. Now, this may have not have been the only apport that took place at Ape Canyon. One reading of the stones and boulders that rained upon the cabin during the Bigfoot assault is that they may have been apports themselves. Showers of stones are so common in the parapsychological literature that the phenomenon even has its own name, lithoboly. That's a fun word to say. Say it with me, everybody. Lithoboly. Accounts of lithoboly stretch back incredibly early and feature in some of the most famous poltergeist cases. Now, in these events, stones rain upon the roofs of haunted houses, sometimes for days on end, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. Now, if the Bigfoot encountered at Ape Canyon represents some sort of spirit phenomenon, then perhaps these stones they supposedly threw at the cabin were actually apports in the parapsychological sense. What do you think? Now, these are often the bits and pieces that are swept under the rug whenever folks discuss the Ape Canyon attack. We must ask ourselves, what are the odds that someone with a history of psychic activity would encounter a flesh and blood Bigfoot? This isn't to say that it's impossible, but consider this. Psychic phenomena are rare. Seeing a Bigfoot is also rare. How much rarer is it to experience both, sometimes in the same place? It takes very little imagination to connect the two somehow. It seems as if an aura of high strangeness emanated from around both Fred Beck and the Ape Canyon site itself. In his booklet, Fred goes on to describe the attack on the cabin. It is from his testimony that many retellings draw the details of the event. It's interesting to note that it may have been the curious underground sounds that set everyone on edge that day. Hank especially. I mean, we already know he's a terrible shot, and now this? It was after hearing the noises that Hank suggested everybody take their rifles with them to the woods. I mean, because we know we couldn't rely on him to make the shot. And so Fred wrote this. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring, about 100 yards from our cabin, to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles just to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant, I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away, on the other side of the little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree, poking its head out from the side of the tree, and at the same time, Hank shot. Imagine that. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his shots, and imagine that, he missed. Someone may say that that was quite a distance to see the bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it, running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view, pulling a Hank and missing entirely. The siege then unfolded in Fred's booklet, just as we discussed in the beginning, a curious postscript to the events absent from the most presentations of the Ape Canyon events. Comes from the October 29, 1967 edition of the Oregonian. The article claims that a group of Bigfoot attacked a miner's cabin near Mount St. Helens in 1924, leaving behind tracks all of the right foot, the perfect one-legged ape track. Now, this story obviously refers to the Ape Canyon incident. While the author of the article clearly included this detail to discredit the miner's claims, one-legged trackways are another persistent anomaly in Bigfoot reports. They're not found often, but they're found often enough and only add to the mysterious aura around the phenomenon. Now, for years afterward, Fred Beck wrestled with how to incorporate the events of that day into his own spiritual worldview. In I Fought the Ape Men on Mount St. Helens, Washington, he eventually concluded this. Since that day in 1924, I have went on and progressed and have learned much. And now I can look back and put the puzzle together from the reservoir of knowledge I have acquired and learned. In the true sense, everything in the material world is a manifestation. Ever since the time the first essence of consciousness formed from the great void that we cannot describe, different planes or dimensions of beings were created or manifested. Occasionally, we of this dimension of space can be conscious of other beings of a different vibration and consciousness. The abominable snowmen are from a lower plane. When the condition and vibration is at a certain frequency, they can easily, for a time, appear in a very solid body. They are not animal spirits, but also lack the intelligence of a human consciousness. This is, of course, when reading of evolution, we have read many times conjecture about the missing link between man and the anthropoid ape. The snowmen are a missing link in consciousness, neither animal nor human. No one will ever capture one, and no one will ever kill one. In other words, present to the world, a living one in a cage, or find a dead body of one to be examined by science. Now, naturally, none of this sits well with orthodox cryptozoologists who are heavily invested in the idea that someday we will be able to capture or kill a Bigfoot specimen. Couple Fred's controversial statement with his fantastic life, and you get the perfect recipe for a story which will be cherry-picked or ignored outright. Now, to that end, some cryptozoologists have done their best to discredit Fred Beck, both calling his booklet into question and engaging in character assassination. Some say that Fred's son, who helped him write the book, injected his own viewpoints. Others slander Fred, saying that he had gone senile by the time he recorded his memoir. Remember, these are attacks from people who believe in Bigfoot. There are skeptical arguments as well. They find ample room for attack in Fred's metaphysical views and even call into question the Ape Canyon incident itself. In 1983, claims emerged that local YMCA students may have been responsible for the event. Before Mount St. Helens erupted, youths at Camp Meehan near Spirit Lake would be brought to the edge of Ape Canyon, where they would often toss stones into the gorge below. It's an interesting possibility, but How many YMCA youth have hairy ape-like arms, like the one that reached into the cabin? And we are left with so many questions regarding Ape Canyon. Is it a true tale, a hoax, or a misidentification? If true, does it represent an attack by an unknown species of animal, or something from the realm of nightmares? We can't summarize the events more elegantly than Fred Beck himself. I have lived with this experience with the abominable snowman. I have encountered them on the slopes of Mount St. Helens. I have looked deep into myself to tell you of their nature. I have had both the earthly experience of encountering them by Ape Canyon and the spiritual experience of knowing and telling what they are. I have walked through the messy cliffs of Ape Canyon and seen a primeval loneliness, reminiscent of life as it must have been years ago. I have explored the distant future, which beckons to us with hope. I have told you my story, and it is true. Abominable snowmen are a part of the creation. Will we hear much more from them? Will their habitat change from selected mountains to nearer our populous cities? I think they will. They are just one little mystery from the ocean of mysteries. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Did Jacob and Stan earlier in this video truly encounter the beast that so many legends and native tribes speak of, or do they simply imagine the whole thing? Are the tales that have been haunting the region of Ape Canyon true, or simply myth? Will I ever shave my beard? And most importantly, why is Hank such a terrible shot? Please, let me know what you think down in the comments below. I want to hear from you. As always, if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more videos just like this one. So keep an open mind, y'all. I love you guys, and I'll catch you all in the very next video.